living in Scotland, to go, oh, this is bound to be, oh, no, it's not. Oh. Archaic, the new... Oh, wow, there's someone on the microphone.
I think we're on. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to take some questions now. So we've got 2 microphones down here at the front. And if you do want to ask a question from the microphone, feel free to make your way to one of the microphones and form an orderly queue. I have been asked to say, if you are asking a question, do just try and keep it brief. We're not looking for sermons. Come back here Sunday morning, you'll get one of those, but not tonight from the microphone. And we will try and weave in some of the questions we've had, thanks to everyone who's been sending questions in via text and web and everything else. So why don't we start with a question from the front. I'm going to make sure there's an opportunity for both our guests to respond. But if it is directed to one of them, just let us know that when you ask your question.
We have name as well.
Yes, and if you'd like to tell us your name as well, and as you ask your question. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Curtin Spence. I've got a question directed at Justin Trottier. Hopefully I pronounced that last name right.
Pretty good.
Okay. All right, so one of my questions was, during the conversation, the moral, it sounded like the moral apex was humanity, or that humanity was the moral authority of the universe currently. So currently that humans have the highest moral values over, let's say, cows. But given enough time with something like AI, or as Friedrich Nietzsche was kind of mentioned a couple times, the Übermensch, or the evolved kind of human or a different type of being that would evolve into having higher abilities, either in cognitive areas or in whatever categorical areas you think a more virtuous system would occur, wouldn't that then make us cows? Wouldn't we be to the Übermensch or this superior AI what cows are to what we are right now?
That's interesting.
So could we become a lesser species, in the sense if another species, if we had aliens maybe who came along?
Yeah, and is there anything wrong with that?
Okay.
Talking from a naturalistic point.
Let's hear from Justin first, and then see what Andy has to say.
Well, I was going to mention the alien response that other Justin here preempted, because of course, I mean, we may be living in a universe where there are other intelligences out there, and I think, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, I think a majority of humans, when polled, consistently say they believe that to be the case, that we're not alone, and it's likely that if we were to encounter other intelligent beings, that they would be far, in a way, more advanced cognitively. Now, I get, or with respect to their intelligence, but the question is in terms of their moral value as persons, and I would use persons differently from humans. We're humans, but we're both persons, us and these aliens, whether that makes a difference. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. Any being that is capable of self-determination, of autonomous actions, any being that can bear, in a meaningful sense, responsibility for the choices that they make, again, back to the rights and responsibility conversation that Andy and I had, would equally be deserving of human rights protection. So I would accord it to us, I would accord it to these other beings.
Would that be like, well then, I'm sure your shoes would be made of leather. Would then it be okay if we were made of the finest kind of boot qualities of this Übermensch or anything like that, because we don't have any better
Is there some
rights,
sense in which the fact that they're far more cognitively superior, in sense makes us less valuable in comparison?
Any being that has the minimal standards is deserving of the same rights and protections.
Well, let's
maybe I'm misunderstanding
let
the
Andy
question.
respond there, because you sound like you want to.
Yeah, well, very quickly, I mean, I think the question you raise is actually one that's taken very, very seriously in ethics, and it's got a fun term. The term that's used in ethical theory is utility monster. So a utility monster is something that has the ability and the right, just because it's so much more superior, to use another species for its benefit. So human beings are the utility monsters of cows and other members of the animal kingdom. Now we could talk about we want to treat them fairly and kindly, but nevertheless we are the utility monsters. And the problem goes that I think you're raising at is along comes E.T. Sort of zips here out of a black hole, and it's not so much about whether Justin, we go, oh, welcome E.T., we grant you human rights. It's E.T. looks at us and goes, fantastic. I am your utility monster, and I have all kinds of things I want to use you for as human beings. And if, rights and whatever you want to term it is simply a case of ability, and that creature is so much more capable than us, then, all bets are off. And the AI question raises the same thing. And of course, what's interesting is science fiction, I think, explores a lot of this. One of the reasons why I think it's fun to read sci-fi is sci-fi explores these kinds of ideas. And what does happen if we generate an AI that is so far beyond anything we can imagine, and it looks at us and goes, yeah, thanks, lads and lasses. But
you sound like you want to make a quick response, and then we'll move
on. I feel like my
point
of view is kind of being caricaturized here. I mean, I've never said that it's whoever is the most intelligent that is the only bearer of rights. I'm saying any species, and I'm the one who wants to expand the rights to more species, not
but I'm ET
reserve
and I
them
want to
for
restrict
us
them.
or whoever. Yeah, wants to restrict them to us or the next most intelligent aliens that we happen to encounter. Anybody who is capable of having these capacities.
This keys into another question. I'm going to say thank you for your question at this point. This one came in from the audience on text. And the question is, Justin, could you elaborate more on how rights flow from capacities? Because I think that's something we never quite got to in the conversation is, okay, you've acknowledged we all have, anyone who has these particular capacities to self-determination, to sentience, to self-awareness, and so on, has these rights. But the question is, how do those rights flow from such capacities? How do you link them intrinsically to these capacities?
That's where the connection between rights and responsibilities is critical. Because by having the same capacities that give us rights protections also makes us able to enter meaningfully into relationships with other people and to bear responsibility to those other people and to be held accountable if we violate their rights. So I agree with Andy very much on this point that you cannot tear apart rights and responsibilities. Together, they are what make us capable of entering into these kinds of relationships with other human beings.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, very quickly. I think we're still ultimately the issue here. There's some things that unite us. I think one of the things that does actually fundamentally divide us is I think we're still basically on preference. And it's interesting, the dialogue we had the other night, Ian, who for a lot of the evening took a similar tack to Justin, then went a slightly different direction and said at the end, actually said, I have to admit I'm a relativist. But I think in a sense it's okay for Justin, for you to say, yeah, I believe that these things lead to the following. I think the difficulty is somebody turns around and goes, that's lovely for you, but your values can go jump because I have the power and the ability. I don't need to listen to you. And of course, he's turned up several times this evening. Friedrich Nietzsche's comment about, he didn't use the language of human rights because he was earlier than that, but he said when people say, you should behave this way, his answer was, that's just the weak using that kind of language to get the strong to do what they want. But actually, if you have the strength and if you have the power, you can do what you like, you can make the rules. And I think you have, the struggle is, can we get beyond personal preference?
We'll go to another question from here, yes.
Hi, my name is Glenn McDonald. I'm one of those atheist listeners to your show, and I'm thrilled to be here to see this in person.
Thank you for listening.
Welcome.
Gentlemen, you were both fantastic and eloquent, and I'm really grateful to be here tonight. So,
Thanks for coming.
Andy, we heard you argue tonight that naturalism as a grounding leads to kind of a subjective grounding for human value,
Yes.
and you seemed unhappy with that, or unsatisfied by that.
Yep.
If the Bible's to be believed, on Christian theism, God is the grounding for human value, right? But by definition, that's subjective, right? The subject, a subject, God, a person, 3 persons, 1 person, however you want to split that up, but a person is of the opinion that human beings, his creations, in his image, have value, right? So that is a subjective belief. And we also know from the Bible, if it is to be believed, that this God sometimes changes his mind. And in a pertinent example, he repented that he had made all these humans in his image, and he drowned them all to death, right? So if it's true that our value is subjective to God's belief, and that he does change his mind on things at times, how does that provide a stronger foundation than naturalism?
That's a really good question.
thank you for the question.
And thank you for that. And again, really appreciate you kind of coming. I'd say a couple of things. I mean, I think it's interesting. Let's begin where you angled in on the question of subjectivity. I think it sounds like you sort of recognized the problem, because it's looked like you were kind of sort of running a variation of it's a problem, but you've got the same problem. It's particularly a problem, of course, for if we live in an atheistic reality and all we have are human subjects, and of course we have 8 billion human subjects right now, all of whom have different preferences, and of course how dare you tell somebody else that your preference wins. Or as somebody put it to me once, they said, human rights, they claimed, is a Western invention, and you guys are simply being imperialistic. You British people did it then, you're doing it now, trying to tell us, and I won't tell you which country it was, how we should or shouldn't behave. In the case of God, of course, if God exists, and of course I believe that he does, Justin hasn't yet convinced me otherwise. If God exists, then of course we're not just talking about, just another subject, or even a slightly bigger version of us. That can sometimes be the mistake people fall into about God. God is like a sort of rather large, he's like us, but just a little bigger. God is the one who underpins the whole of reality. God is the ultimate it. God is the ground of being, to use the language of philosophers. And the reason that gives us the foundation is God is the one who calls every atom, every particle, whether it's making up a table, a chair, or you or I, into reality. And it's therefore that fact that we have that value, we have that dignity, ontologically, to use that word meaning, nature, that we have those inalienable rights, is because that's the way that God has constituted us. So to be a human being is to be a bearer of value and dignity and rights and so forth. Now, I don't want to go too far down the flood thing, because we're trying to keep the answer short, but what I would say is this. One of the things that's interesting is it's actually because human life matters that, of course, things like justice matter, and why God takes things so seriously. If God merely overlooked human inhumanity to other human beings, went, I don't care. I mean, Hitler was a nice guy, Mao Zedong, he was lovely, he had a kitten. We go, what kind of God are you? Because if human life really matters, then injustice is a very, very, very serious thing. And God takes that very, very seriously. Ultimately, so seriously that, and we talked about this earlier, that God stepped into history in the person of Jesus.
That raises the question of whether God could have acted any differently, right? But I want to pick up on a couple of other things here.
Justin.
If, as you say, God is the creator of the universe, the ground of being, if we're subjects that have been sort of created by this deity, then that would kind of concern me, actually. I would see us as almost like playthings, part of his divine plan, rather than subjects, rather than ends in and of ourselves. That the question of whether or not in that kind of framework we have moral worth, as Immanuel Kant would say, as ends in and of ourselves, whether that's consistent with the idea that God has ordained all of this, he set this in motion, and he also has a plan, and we're just kind of filling in the pieces as actors on a stage. And just when you and I have talked about questions of ethics before, and we've had this debate before as well, but I think it's relevant to the question that was asked, which is that if God is the one kind of calling the shots, deciding what's right and wrong, why should we follow it? I think that kind of gets to the question that was asked. Why are we compelled to follow those commandments? Is it just arbitrary commandments that we have to follow because he is so much bigger and more powerful than we are?
I think, as you've asked a couple of questions, we'll let Andy
I was going to say, I'm aware we don't want to just start the dialogue and there's
question.
people waiting, but let me try and briefly say a couple of things. On the first point you made at the start of your... Remind me the first point I wanted to angle in on.
Which is the question of what was the first point?
God's plan for humans.
Are we
just playthings? Absolutely. What's interesting is, I'd say two things very briefly here. I think the Bible is very clear that's far from who we are. Again, I bring you back to the incarnation, because the value that God demonstrates there in the cross is astronomical, is almost infinite, really, the value God demonstrates. But here's the interesting thing. We were talking about this the other night, a few of us, that I know for many of my secular humanist friends, freedom and autonomy are a big thing. This idea of going, I don't want to be controlled by God, I want to be, self-determining and so on and so forth. I just want to gently say, if naturalism is true, you do not have that. You are nothing more than a plaything of the laws of physics and chemistry and biology. The reason you're thinking as you are now is because of your brain chemistry. What's going on in your brain now is a result of the previous brain state and the previous brain state. You can't escape from that world of causality, which is why so many atheists and atheist philosophers are increasingly arguing for determinism. What I would say, if God exists, the God of Christian theism exists, God has the ability to actually grant you genuine freedom and genuine moral choice to be made, because physicalism is not the only game in town. But if it is, you are not
Well, this gets
free.
us into a very big debate about how an immaterial being can have
That's a whole other discussion.
I think
come into a physical world.
We'll have to leave that one there.
will.
I think the second question, if you do want to address it quickly,
Yes.
Andy, was a form of the eutropho dilemma, I
Yes.
think, where if God commands things, do we follow them because
Yeah.
they're the right thing? Well, then in that case, do we need God
Exactly.
to command them in the first place?
Yeah, what was interesting, actually, again, we're rehearsing some of where we went the other night. What I think is fascinating about the eutropho dilemma, for those who aren't familiar with it, let me recapitulate it very quickly. It's the idea that, does God command things because they're good? In which case goodness is a standard outside God, or are things good because God commands them, in which case God could command me to poke, visiting.
It makes morality arbitrary.
Yes, God commands me to poke Justin Brierley in the eye, and that's a good thing. Of course, the same thing applies to everything. It applies to society, for example. Are the laws that the society determines good because good is external? Or are they just good because society determines them? And it sort of collapses inwards. In the case of God, and certainly the God of the Bible, the understanding that Christians have always had from the beginning is that it's actually neither of those options. That God is goodness. God is love. God is beauty in his very, very character. And then what God commands and acts flows out of that. And that's always been the Christian answer from the very beginning. And nobody really in philosophy of religion takes eutropho that seriously.
I'm going to move the questions because we must take some more questions. So let's have another one from this side on this microphone. Yes.
Thanks very much. Justin, Tom Rogers here, and another question for Justin T. And that is, what would it take to convince you that God does exist? Would the right science...
Which God?
The creator that put us together.
So what? Okay, great
So
question.
the Christian God or the Muslim God or...
Yeah.
What would it take to convince you, Justin, that God exists? You've asked, well, which God? Well, let's just say a creator of the univerce. Let's say, is there anything?
Or the
hold on a second.
creator
I
of
mean,
us.
the God that's
Creator of us.
often imagined by Judeo-Christian monotheists has certain attributes that I don't even think are logically coherent. Right? So first you'd have to explain how a God can be at the same time omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. I don't think that's a coherent, those three things even fit together logically. So we've got to start with that. We've got to start with
What
that.
if we could prove that?
Well, you've got to come up with some kind of formulation that can reconcile the inconsistencies
Right, yeah.
inherent
So,
in those,
so for you, it's
those
rather that you
attributes.
find the actual idea of the Judeo-Christian God inconsistent. Do you want to respond to that, Andy, yourself?
Yeah, I would be very, very careful because the question was asked of Justin, and it'd be very, very unfair for me to say, well, the real reason Justin isn't a believer is for these things. So I'd be very careful not to even remotely go there. But I would say this. I think when it comes to evidence, human beings can be quite interesting in the way we approach evidence. For example, we can be surrounded by evidence and overlook it. A really good example from science, for example, is smoking. Everybody knows that smoking causes cancer, but my sister continues to smoke. She can justify herself in the light of evidence. And I think as human beings, we're very good at justifying ourselves in the light of evidence. Now, of course, if atheism is true, Christians are guilty of that. But if Christianity is true, atheists are guilty of that. But it's interesting, one or two atheists have made interesting remarks around this. So Thomas Nagel, very famous American atheist, once wrote this in a book he published, I think it was 1986, in The View from Nowhere, I think was where he writes this. He says, it's not that I don't believe in God, it's that I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. And the one thing I would say is this: nobody is neutral on the God question. There's no Switzerland of the mind. Nobody is neutral on the God question. And the question is, as we approach the evidence and have these conversations, can we be self-aware enough to recognize that, both on either side of this conversation this evening?
There's lots of things for which there's plenty of evidence, but people don't believe it. At the risk of making some enemies here, I would include evolution in that category.
Well, let's move on from that can of worms to...
Can of worms. But the worms may become something in due course. So,
I've got two questions here that came in on the text and SMS and so on. I think that are essentially the same question, so let me ask them both here, and they're aimed at you this time, Andy.
Oh, good. Okay.
What do you do with the archaic laws that seem to oppress the rights of women? And similarly, Christianity has been used to violate many human rights. What do we do with that? So given the history of Christianity in some respects and archaic laws, perhaps that people see in the Bible maybe, that have oppressed the rights of women, I think this goes back to Justin's question in the debate.
Yeah.
How does Christianity, in any sense, ground us if we've got these kinds of issues?
I think so. And I think what I'm very conscious of in that question, and I think I alluded to this earlier, I think both atheists and Christians, but obviously I'm answering as a Christian for this, need to be very cognizant of our history. I think all of us actually have things in our history that are embarrassing, and Christians certainly do. I mean, one of the examples for me that I often reflect on, and this is the Crusades. Which concerns me deeply because my academic study was in Islam. My PhD is in Quranic studies. I have many, many Muslim friends. I've had dialogues with hundreds, thousands of Muslims in the last 20 years or so. And I look back at history and what Christians did in the Muslim world in the name of Christianity. You know, whichever clown it was had the idea of painting the cross, a symbol of love and forgiveness, on military hardware. I mean, where did that ever come from? And I can only look at that and wince. What I would say is interesting. When we critique Christian history, and when we critique how Christians have behaved, the question I always want to ask is, what is the standard that we're holding people to? What we're doing is we're drawing them back to Jesus Christ and saying you're not being Christ-like. The interesting question is on the other side, when someone holds to a different worldview, to what can you hold them and say you should have behaved otherwise? So take a Joseph Stalin. I am not putting him in Justin's camp. Be very careful here. That's not what I'm doing. We can label him however we want to. But what would you say to a Joseph Stalin on his deathbed? To say, Joseph, I want you to consider what you've done. How should you live differently, given his communistic belief system? Let's just leave it at that. The answer is you can hold him to nothing. And so I find it interesting when we critique Christians in history, and we should certainly do that. We shouldn't duck that question. It's Jesus that we're drawing.
Do you want to make a brief comment as well on that, Justin?
The only thing I would say is I would just point to the fact that the person who thinks the opposite of you on a given subject matter can easily make the exact same argument you just made, can easily point to the same tradition, the same biblical injunctions. They may find different parts of the Bible that back them up. I just don't see the difference. The Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda thinks that they're doing God's work by butchering people in the name of God. And that's happening in the modern world.
Well, I'd say a couple of things there very quickly. One, of course, if you push that to its logical conclusion, you've just argued full-blown relativism. You can do whatever you want and claim it on anything else. The same goes true for atheism. You can behave abhorrently and say, well, I'm doing this because I believe that, you know...
Of course you can, but it's not a feature in your worldview.
No. But then let me say something else here that I think is often missed. The example you made, not just now, but earlier, let's just talk about for a minute, which is we look at slavery and the way that some Christians, use the Bible to justify slavery. Yeah. What's interesting... And this fascinates me because Wilberforce is one of my areas of interest, and having read extensively on that period, scholars who've looked at that in detail would say it is pretty darn clear that those who claim to be using the Bible to justify slavery were merely thrashing around trying to counter scriptural arguments coming from the other side. This is demonstrated by the fact the very same people who were arguing for slavery using the Bible argued for something else. People are unaware that Wilberforce fought other campaigns. One of the campaigns he fought was to allow British missionaries to distribute the Bible in the in India, which is then part of the British Empire, in the Indian languages. Many of the same people who campaigned for slavery were trying to get the Bible outlawed in India. Why? The argument literally went, and you can read this in Hansard, in the records of the British Parliament, the argument was, the last thing we need are the Indian natives getting it into their heads. They are made in the image of God, and they are equal to the white man. That will be a disaster.
But that's a good example of a section of the Bible that supports an anti-slavery position, but there's plenty that support
but my point being
that support slavery,
that those who are using the Bible...
Injunctions where slaves are told to obey their masters. What do you say, that God got it wrong in those sections?
What
higher authority can you invoke?
Well, we're jumping track here, Justin. I'm making the argument...
You brought up the slavery issue.
Yeah, what I'm making... let me keep you on one argument. I'm making the argument, it's very easy to go, oh yes, look, Christians used the Bible to justify something, when actually they didn't. It was a mere flag of convenience. On the Bible and slavery, let me say a couple of things. And again, I don't want to go down the slavery route, but since you raise it, let's address it. One of the huge mistakes that's made is people compare what was going on in terms of the ancient world and slavery with what the European powers and the Arabs actually did in Africa, because the Arab slave trade was even bigger than the Western slave trade. In the Bible, largely what we have is indentured slavery, where if you were poor, if you had no ability of earning an income, if you had no land, you could sell yourself into slavery. And if you read the Old Testament, that's why you have that law structure.
That's not the only time there was slavery. God compelled the Hebrews to conquer other peoples and to put them into slavery against their will. That's
but you
in
have
the
to
Bible
look at
too.
what
That's God's command.
you have to look at what the institution of slavery was in the ancient world. And rather than have a debate now around what it was or it wasn't, I recommend the book to people.
But Andy, you brought up slavery
I'm
and then
gonna
tried to argue that it was a simple matter of reading into the Bible that it was anti-slavery, and it's not.
Well,
you have to make the case based on non-biblical.
We're going to have to
that is
draw
to say
this
secular
this
argument.
debate.
He needs to read Wilberforce.
Let's assume that we're going to agree to disagree on that one. Would you like to come and ask a question? We've just probably got time for a couple more questions before we have to draw.
Hey, my name's Cody.
Hey, Cody.
And can I just say I'm so psyched to see Justin Brierley here. Like, I'm a bigger fan
Well,
of
that's
this
very
JB
kind.
than the other one.
Thank you. Thank
A
you,
lot of answering.
My question's for JT.
JT.
So clearly we've been flirting with this idea that you can't really ground your moral epistemology in something objective, right? And you've been kind of like hard to pin down throughout the dialogue about where you actually place it. It seems as though you ground it in something like rationality and consciousness, or conscience, sorry. Is that right?
That's one part of it, sure.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying, or what my question is how would you justify moral epistemic duties? So moral duties that involve sort of assenting to a certain true proposition, right? So you ought to believe what is in fact the case, regardless of sort of pragmatic utilities and things like that. Now, notice that you can't appeal to your own rationality in order to justify these beliefs, because then you'd be arguing in a circle, right? And so, how would you ground these beliefs? And
that's quite a complex question. But I think what you're getting at is why should we aim for truth always?
Right.
Given that that's not necessarily something that.
And some philosophers have pointed out, like Alvin Plantinga, for example, says that some things have a sort of such a high epistemic status that you just find yourselves with those beliefs, like they just sort of appear. You don't choose to believe in them.
Right.
But that's certainly not true for moral beliefs or scientific beliefs even.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
let's just see what Justin has to say in response to
I
this.
have nothing to say. I don't understand the question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Is-
Can you give me an example?
It's a great question.
Yeah, so so basically when confronted with enough evidence where you would make the inference to general relativity, say you're confronted with this sort of cosmic phenomena that would give you reason to believe general relativity is true, right?
That's not exactly the way science works, but go on.
Well, I'm just saying, why would you be under any sort of moral obligation to believe in that in general relativity rather than just withhold belief or just refuse belief?
Well, that's not how science works. So in science, there's
Well, it's certainly not.
falsification. We come up with a theory. We try to make predictions about how certain events should play out if the theory is correct.
Right.
And then we try to falsify the theory based on whether those predictions actually bear out.
I suppose I think what I'm getting
maybe I'm
the
missing the
question
point,
is
but-
I think what the question is, if I'm not mistaken, is the question of is there some moral imperative to aim for truth, even if it may not be particularly beneficial to us either way, but that we should believe things that are true rather than things that are simply advantageous to us, for instance? Because I think the questioner is suggesting that that is at some level difficult for a worldview where we just evolved to believe in things that are advantageous fundamentally rather than in things that are true. This may be taking us beyond the remit of...
No, that's a great question.
Okay.
Yeah,
Let's
I wanna
see
get
what
at
you
it, I
have
wanna
to
get
say. Andy, you say something about it, and then
Yeah.
we'll just see if Justin has
I-
something to say in response. And we're going to have to
I
wrap things
don't
up.
know why are you addressing it to me? I mean, why is that an issue for atheists any more than anybody else?
Well, look, Andy, you sound like
Okay,
you want
you really want to get in on this, so-
Let's have some fun.
I'm going to ask you both to keep it really short because we are going to have to wrap things up now.
Well, here's one of the reasons. There's a couple of reasons why it's a really interesting question. Firstly, many atheist biologists have pointed out that if we just have naturalism, then really where truth fits into that is quite problematic. So Patricia Churchland is my favorite quotation on this. She's an atheist biologist, and she said, look, the nervous system really is only concerned with the 4 Fs: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproducing. And, you call yourself a Christian audience. And then she ends that quote by saying, truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. In other words, quite frankly, evolution doesn't care about truth. It simply cares that you can escape from threats, eat, and pass on your DNA. And there's lots of people in her camp. That's actually probably one of the majority position, actually, in neurobiology. So that's the first issue of going, where does this sort of pursuit of truth come from? But the other place it goes, and I'll just throw this out, and then see if Justin wants to say anything. One of the things I think we've done is we've now, in 21st century Western culture at least, we've separated truth and goodness. Plato, so I'm not going for a Christian now, I'm going for a Greek philosopher, put those two together. He said that actually it is virtuous, it is good to think after what is true, and it is immoral and it is wrong to think that which is false. And he had a whole sort of essay unpacking that. And I think he's right. But of course, he based that on his conception of God, which is God is the good, capital D, capital G. And I would certainly say as a Christian philosopher, I want to go, yes, because if God is the source of all truth, then actually it is virtuous to think about what is true, and it is actually immoral to think about what is false. And say Plato and others have jammed those together. We've ripped them apart.
Let's just allow a quick response from Justin,
Sure.
and then we're going to draw this to a close.
If God is the creator of everything and the ground of being, why I still don't see why I should care unless I make the decision to care. So everything still comes from human agency and human choice. Whether you're a Christian who decides that you're going to kind of go along with God's plan and sort of be bound by the rules God has set, or you're an atheist who still finds yourself with the same capacities for self-determination, autonomous decision-making, all the things that I've been repeating a few times here. At some point, it's still a decision that you as a human being have to make. It's the same issue with God kind of commanding you to do good. Well, that's a fine thing for him to do, but unless you decide to do good, you're not actually acting ethically. So I think the reason I was a bit confused before was I just didn't understand how this is a challenge for only one side of this debate. We're all human beings with the same capacities, and we all have to make a decision. If we're Christians, we might decide that we believe God commands us to do a certain set of things, and we're going to do it. And that's how those actions of ours get to have ethical worth. If we just do them because God commanded us to do it, there is no ethical worth in those actions.
My sincere apologies to everyone who's waiting at the microphones, but we are going to have to call it a day there. Perhaps Andy and Justin can make themselves available on the floor. But for the moment, can I have another round of applause for both our guests this evening?
Thank you.
You guys want to shake hands?
Justin, thank you. A pleasure as always. And
And, thank you guys.